As the principal and founder of Tamika Butler Consulting, she focuses on shining a light on inequity, inequality, and social justice. So with that, I'm going to stop talking because I want to hear from her. Take it away, Tamika.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I'm thrilled to be here. I just have a little bit of time with you all, so I'm just gonna go ahead and jump right in. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Always having multiple screens, having to organize it all a bit. All right. So hopefully folks can see that. It looks like it's working on my screen, but since I can't see anybody, I'm just gonna go with it.
It looks great, Tamika. Looks great.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make equity actionable. And I'm going to ask for some participation throughout. So just be ready for that. But I always like to start by asking everybody to just be mindful of the fact that we're on Indigenous land. And for folks who haven't really thought about this before, just know that there are places you can go, you can learn about where you are located. I am in Los Angeles on Tongva land. And so this is a great website folks can go to. I invite you, if you feel moved to put into the chat, you know, whose land you are inhabiting. And just know that as you do this work, Indigenous people should always be at the heart of our work. And beyond just doing these land acknowledgements at the beginning of talks, we have to start thinking about how we can couple these acknowledgements with authentic and informed action. And I think sometimes we don't talk about that openly. So again, totally encourage people to visit this link and feel free to share whose land you're on in the chat. So just moving forward, I just wanted to do a check-in with everybody, and hopefully folks can put into the chat. Just give me one word to describe how you're feeling coming into this meeting, and I'll just wait a second to see some of those answers populate. But again, just one word to describe how you're coming into this meeting feeling. Overwhelmed, a lot of excited, I love it. Hopeful. Rushed. Me too. Nervous. Keep sharing. Open. I love it. Curious is a great one. Happy. A lot more curious. And I think, you know, one of the questions I always have when I start a presentation, just so I can get a sense of the room, and especially since we're not together in person, is how long have you been interested in transportation equity work, or just equity work generally? How long has this been on your mind? How long have you been thinking about it? How long has this been something that you've been curious about learning more about? Just so I can get a sense of where folks are at. So thank you, Angela, for getting us started. 6 years. What do other folks think? And it's okay if it's like, today's the first time I'm really thinking about it and putting on this thought. 20 years, love it. So how long have you been interested? And that doesn't mean you necessarily have been doing the work, but how long have you been interested? So a lot of folks who have been thinking about this for a long time. Do we have any folks who are newer to this? That's, you know, buying a house is a great time when folks start to think about generational wealth and inequity. Thanks for sharing that, Melissa, really appreciate it. A few more folks, how long have you been thinking about equity work? How long have you been interested in it? I'm disappointed this isn't in person too. This is a lot easier to do when it's in person, but this will be as interactive as you all make it. If we have a super active chat, it will feel super active and engaged. And so I really encourage people to not just, sit on the sideline, but to the extent they can, to participate. So I asked you one word, and I asked you to share. Something I like to do with folks sometimes when we are in person is just ask how you're feeling. And usually I would put you in a small group or a partner share and ask you to take a look at this picture, take a look at the blob tree, and figure out which blob describes how you're feeling today. Figure out which blob is really where you're at. And since we're all, sitting probably individually, what I would ask folks is to look at the blob tree and to figure out which one represents how you're feeling, and then just make a mental note to yourself, what do you need to be fully present, right? And again, usually we would do this in groups, but I think this is just a good place to kind of stop, take a deep breath, reflect, know that we're going to be going quickly through a lot of material, that there's a lot happening in the world, but what would it take for you to be fully present, right? And I think that to the extent you can do that and check in with yourself in that way, that would be really helpful. I will tell you that I feel like I'm a number 5. Number 5 is down there on the ground laying down. And so, I'm asking you to be honest with yourself. And so I want to be honest with all of you. I can't say that you're going to get my best today, right? There was a young man killed yesterday over air fresheners, right? Just simply miles away from where there is a trial for a police officer who killed George Floyd, right? He was only 20 years old. He had a son, and this is a lot, right? You'll see I have another tweet I'm sharing. As a Black person, we're dealing with folks who get killed for running, folks who get killed in their own home, folks who get killed for Skittles. It says Black lives are in danger every single day. So, I had, this big plan to talk about some of the things you are actually facing in the Southern District, the difference between, what you should expect in urban areas versus rural areas, and really going deep. But the reality is, it feels like we're still at a basic level where as a Black person, we're still trying to figure out how do folks see our humanity, right? Where we're still showing up for work, we're still being visible on Zoom, we're still doing all the things we have to do, but it is exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And beyond being exhausting, as the mother of a son, a Black son, this feeling of helplessness that I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to protect him. So I want to acknowledge and apologize up front that you might not get my best today, because the trauma and pain of being Black in this country is hard, even when you have to do a public speech, right? And so for some of you, if you see me talk before, some of this might seem really familiar. And the reason it's going to seem really familiar is because it feels like things aren't changing. And so sometimes people say, well, let's go deeper, let's get to the practical place. But my whole thing is, but we're still at this basic level of asking for our humanity. And so I'm going to keep saying the same things until it feels like things are changing. And so with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and what I do. And then I'm going to tell you why this work matters to me. And then I'm going to ask you to think about white spaces and really think about what you can do. So a little bit about me. I am from Nebraska. I am from an area. I'm from a city in Nebraska, but I grew up, understanding a lot about what's happening in rural areas. I have an older sister who has a farm in Iowa with her family. And so I've always thought about my work and, what does it look like in a city? What does it look like in a rural area? Not just as someone who lives in LA, not just what does it look like on the coast, but what does it look like for the folks who matter the most? Everybody hasn't been to Nebraska. And so people always say, tell me a little bit about Nebraska. It's important to know that our motto is the good life. It is a good life. And then other than that, there's a lot of corn. When most people think of Nebraska, they think of flat and they think of corn. Until this last election, when people started to realize that we were a place where people might freeze on the runway, but we had this very small sliver of a district that would be very important in a presidential election because the way we split our electoral votes is different. And Nebraska's 2nd district is where I grew up. It's where my family lives. They're somewhere in those demographics. Now, at some point growing up in Nebraska, I thought, man, I'm too gay, I'm too Black, I'm not Midwestern at all, I have to leave. And so I ended up going to law school at Stanford, in part because I thought Palo Alto and San Francisco were the same place as a small town person. But then once I got to the West Coast, I realized I am very Midwestern, and I appreciate that and I like that. I'm a Midwesterner raised by a Southern mother from South Carolina, and there is just a different speed and a different level of friendliness than I think people appreciate. And so I had to acknowledge that of all the identities I hold, one of the most important to me is a Midwesterner. After I graduated from Stanford Law School, I started a legal clinic. And I started a legal clinic in the historically Black neighborhoods in San Francisco, Bayview, Hunters Point, and the Western Addition. And this legal clinic was a one-stop shop for anybody who had employment issues. And when I started my clinic, it was really tough to get anyone to talk to me about employment discrimination, because before they would talk to me about employment discrimination, they wanted to know where I stood on transportation issues. SFMTA had just started a new line, a new Muni line going into Bayview Hunters Point. And the people in Bayview Hunters Point did not feel like that was a line for them. They felt like they weren't planned with, or they weren't planned for, that in some ways they were planned against. No one talked to them about the stops, the times, right? Or the jobs for who was going to build this rail line. And what it felt like for folks who don't know San Francisco, Bayview Hunters Point is where Candlestick Park used to be, where the San Francisco 49ers used to play. And so many people in that community felt like it wasn't for them, it was to get fans and tourists in and out to football games. And why that was so devastating is because, like so many Black communities, no matter where you're located, this was a community that was geographically isolated from the core of the city. And so people felt like no one's talking to us about how we access jobs. No one's talking to us about how we get to quality education, quality healthcare, right? It didn't feel like it was for them. And that was really, as a lawyer, the first job where I was like, wow, transportation is the prism through which we should see all other social justice issues. Whether or not, again, you're talking about economic mobility, or whether or not you're talking about an ability to get to vaccines. You can't talk about these things without talking about transportation. So I fell in love with transportation. I eventually became the executive director of the LA County Bicycle Coalition. And I have continued to kind of fall into urban planning and really love it. And in the fall, I'm starting a PhD in urban planning, focusing on mobility and the way that mobility and laws and land use policies are used to, as my dear friend Charles Brown out of Rutgers says, arrest the mobility of certain groups of people in our society. And what do? I have my own consulting firm. I used to work at Tool Design as a director of equity and inclusion and the California planning director. Love that firm, love the folks there. But last summer, when all of this heaviness really started, I ultimately decided that I just needed to do my own thing, and I needed balance for my family. And so I started my own firm where a majority of my clients are still transportation clients, but half of my clients are museums, nonprofits, individuals who need coaching. And it allows me to really do intersectional work. And so I always like to set the frame of why I talk about race. Because often when I talk about race, I get this look from people, this look like Kanye saying, did I really lose a presidential election? What happened to my marriage? What's going on, right? Like, this is the look I get. But what I try to explain to people is that for certain groups of people, we know that driving with air fresheners can get us killed because our whole life has been spent understanding that public space is about policing where we can and can't go. So whether or not you're talking about the sign from Alabama about who is able to swim, whether or not you're talking about parks and open space, right? My mom, who grew up in South Carolina, tells me all the time about the beautiful beaches that she was never allowed to go to. The way that certain groups of people are always on the outside looking in, wondering why certain people have things and other people don't. And when this is surprising to people, I don't really understand because our whole country is based on exploiting labor of folks of color and taking their land. As I've already said, I'm in Los Angeles sitting on stolen Tongva land. This is a book that Hitler referred to as something like a Bible to him because it talked about the way that people of color are diluting the human race. It's also a book written by someone who has been referred to as many as one of the forefathers of our national park system. So our national park system, a system that was founded on stealing land from people, putting up fences, charging, and keeping certain people out of their own land. And to this day, if you look at statistics about who uses our national park systems and the demographics of those people, you'll see that folks of color, low income folks, are still struggling to access these parks at the same level as affluent folks of color or affluent folks who are white, right? And so we know, again, many of us inherently know that when we look at a map, this is what people are seeing, even if they're not saying it. That there's some areas where you don't go, there's some areas that are okay, there's some areas where speculation is happening. We know that it is race that determines what types of land use are appropriate in certain places. Every time my son sees one of these, he thinks it's a crane. He says, Mom, a crane, right? He's 2, he likes construction. He doesn't realize that this crane is going underground and finding oil. And the thing is, we live in a very affluent neighborhood, right? We live adjacent to a neighborhood, Baldwin Hills. When a lot of, young white kids back in the day were watching the show The Hills on MTV, a lot of black kids were watching a show called Baldwin Hills on BET about this community where there are rich, well-educated black folks. It's also a community that is adjacent to the largest urban oil drilling facility in the country. It's not because of income. We like to sometimes say, well, why do we have to talk about race? Let's just talk about income. The only reason this is allowed to happen, the only reason my friend who grew up in LA and says all of her friends who grew up in this neighborhood have had miscarriages, have asthma, constantly had bloody noses, is because we allow dangerous land uses where there are people of color. Joe said earlier he's been interested in this work since learning about the freeway revolts in the 60s. Freeways are highways. This is a very popular topic right now because Secretary Pete said something that some people were just hearing for the first time. Well, many of us have been saying it for years and have known it because it's our communities that have been raised and displaced and disregarded. Think about when you're driving. Which communities say next 7 exits? Which communities are, if you blink, you miss it? And if you miss that exit, it's hard to get back. It's hard to connect. We know that highways are some of the largest perpetuators of systematic racism, right? And just using LA, where I'm from, South LA, the area I live in, versus West LA, Brentwood, Beverly Hills, where UCLA is, where I'll be going to school. Think about the disparity in what people have access to. Where are you more likely to find liquor stores than grocery stores? Where are you more likely to find fast food than fresh food? This isn't by accident. And so, for many of us, whether we're planners or engineers or urban designers, when we show up in a community and we say, we're here to talk about transportation, our housing, our parks, or whatever it may be, and we get people asking us a variety of questions, it's because for them, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because they don't lead single issue lives. And that's why intersectionality is so important. Intersectionality, a phrase coined by a Black female attorney, talks about the way that as individuals, we have multiple aspects of our identity, and they all compound and influence one another as we have experiences. That's also true for subject matters. As folks who might do transportation work, we don't have to solve every housing problem. We don't have to solve every problem for folks who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability, but we have to be aware and we have to be able to talk about it. We have to know that for many people, they literally feel like their neighborhood is killing them. And we have to stop getting to this place where we're like, wait, what? And yes, this is my second Schitt's Creek reference. I have a Canadian wife, so it's just par for the course. And when we do this work, we have to understand that we're doing it in white spaces. And many people are like, wait, what is a white space? I think folks have to be willing to talk about race. When we think about urban and regional planners, right? I'm going to urban planning school. We have to realize that they are disproportionately white. More urban and regional planners are white than the representation of white folks in our country. And it certainly is not any better for engineers. And we know it's not just white folks, but it's predominantly white men. And so let me talk to you a little bit. I started off by saying I wasn't at my best. And I know there are people who are sitting at their computers who are other folks of color like me, and particularly other Black folks, are other people who are Asian or Pacific Islanders, those of us who are constantly in the last few weeks, but frankly, in the last few years, decades, experiencing just a constant onslaught of terrorism, aggression, and things that make us fear our life. And then again, we have to show up for work. And it is really hard to be young, gifted, and Black, or young, gifted, and queer, or disabled, or any person of color, or Indigenous, and to still do this work and to think about what it is like for us to walk in a community, knowing we won't be free of harassment. But we have to walk through that community for a walk audit. We have to walk through that community to take measurements if we're going to change the lane width, right? We know as a Black person specifically that it is still tough for Black leaders to advance. This was a whole issue of the Harvard Business Review focused on Black leaders. And what they found is in every organization, no matter the industry, for Black folks to succeed, and again, I'm using Black folks because I'm Black, but this could really apply to any group who has been marginalized and historically oppressed and continues to be oppressed today. For us to survive, we first have to figure out the ways of white folks. We have to figure out just how to show up and make it, just how to be present when our people are dying, when our people are being killed and massacred, right? We have to know that we have to be able to code switch. Code switching is seen as critical for many of us for professional advancement, but it comes at such a great psychological cost, right? And we need our leaders in our organizations and in our industry to start understanding that if they want to promote inclusion and address social inequalities and inequities, they have to understand why a part of the workforce feels like they can't be themselves. And people might say, well, that's just called professionalism. No one can be themselves at work. But the cost is greater for some people. A great example of code switching, think about that video from many years ago when President Obama went into a locker room at a basketball game. He sees the white coach, he shakes his hand and says, how are you doing? The next person he interacts with is a Black guy, and he daps him up and gives him a hug. It's just instincts. It's not like he thought about it, but it's this constant way that so many of us have to code switch. Think about our hair, think about the way we speak, the way we talk, and if we can truly be ourselves. We know that organizational segregation is persistent, that it feels like whiteness is a key credential for moving up in hierarchies. And we have to stop thinking about one-off cases or bad apples and realize that many of these things are built into our organizations and built into the core. And that for many folks who are marginalized, we feel like the only way we can succeed at our organizations is to be invisible, to not show up at work and say, today is a really tough day for me. I live in Georgia. I am of Asian descent, and I just watch people being killed. And you want to know what I think about this project? We can't do that. We just have to make that part of ourselves invisible, right? And often we go into organizations and then we get pushed out. There's this process of coming to an organization and everyone being happy. And I should note, when I say white leadership, I don't just mean white people. Just like when I say sexist or patriarchal leadership, I don't just mean men. We have to realize that we've started doing things where many of us, even women, are like, well, this is what I have to do to succeed. So we may try to emulate those who have been in power, and they have often been white, able-bodied, cisgendered men. And so you can have that type of leadership without fitting those demographics, right? And so when you come into an organization as a person of color, often you feel like there's this honeymoon period. Everybody's excited, but you quickly realize it was a tokenized hire. Part of your job often is to point out how the organization can be more diverse and inclusive. And so you start doing that. You start working within the structures. You start asking for accountability, but you face injury. You face microaggressions and people saying, well, yeah, that's your job, but you just don't understand, right? Not just that, the response is that the organization denies, ignores, or blames you. You pit group, well, we can't give that to the women's group because if we give that to the women's group, we have to give it to everybody. And then what do we hear about these people? Oh, they're bad communicators. They're just not a good fit. And they leave the organization. And then when it's time to hire diverse candidates, hiring managers look around and they say, we either can't find them or we do, but look at their resume. They just jump around a lot. We're not sure if they're going to stay, right? And this happens all the time. Or worse, we don't even look at these people when we're hiring. I want folks to take a minute, just a minute, because we don't have much time left, but just take a minute and write down professionally, who are the people you trust the most? If you have a question about a project, if you're having a tricky client, if you're trying to make a quick hire and you want to reach out to your network, who are the folks who you know will send you good people? Just take a minute and think about who are the folks you trust. And as you make that list, I want you to then review it and think about how similar the people on that list are to you, right? Because what we often see is we get funding, we hear we get a project, we realize we have to staff up, and we reach out to our network, but our network is a lot of folks who are very similar to us. And then we wonder why we can't ever bust out of hiring the same types of folks. And it's curious that our circle of trust are folks who are so similar to us, because when we face things like a pandemic, we're still willing to trust folks of color then. We're still willing to trust low income folks. We're still willing to send out farm workers in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of climate change and never before seen wildfires, and say, hey, but can you pick the food to feed the rest of the country? We're still willing to depend on them to deliver our packages and check us out at the grocery store. But why can't we depend on them in our work? We have to start thinking about what we can do to make concrete change, right? First, we have to understand that not being racist isn't the same as being anti-racist. If you'll notice, I've very subtly threaded in a lot of things you can read and resources you can turn to. Being an anti-racist requires constant work, and it requires an understanding of white supremacy, and you can't be afraid to say it. For people who are afraid to say race or white supremacy, I don't know if I can trust you, because if we can't name a thing, we can't fix a thing. This is a great quote. White supremacy isn't the shark, it's the water, it's everything. It's a system that has been in place to maintain and defend the status quo. And we see when people feel like they're losing their grip on that system, they'll do anything, including storm a Capitol, right? And so if you want to make individual change, there are some questions you can ask yourself every single day. You can constantly be checking in about, are you being anti-racist? Are you being brave, right? Too many people want a safe space. It is not safe to be Black and drive your car or walk or run. So to be Black in this country, I have to be brave every single day, every single day. So if we have privilege, if we are lucky enough to be privileged, why can't we be brave? Ask yourself, not how can I be comfortable, not how can I feel safe, but how can I be brave? How can I decenter whiteness? And how can I force myself to think about racism and white supremacy every single day? And what am I going to do to contribute to the stopping of the killing of Black people, right? Indigenous people, people with disabilities, right? We have to start understanding that this is like a journey. I'm a transportation planner, so I like journeys, I like landmarks. Many of our journeys start out as actors, right? Mel Gibson, great actor, horrible human being, right? Many of us, you can Google him, know many of the things that Mel Gibson has done, the anti-Semitic things, using the N-word, all of these things he's done. But he's a great actor who keeps bouncing back. I use him as an example because sometimes we don't know why we're doing what we're doing. We don't know why people want they, them pronouns, but they tell us to use them, and so we do it. And sometimes that's all you can do. Fake it until you make it, just be an actor. But you have to be able to understand that if you're only acting, if you never take the time to learn why you're doing what you're doing and deeply, deeply try to integrate it into your everyday practice, then at some point you will be Mel Gibson and you will be found out. And people will realize you're just acting. So yes, sometimes you just fake it until you make it, but you got to graduate to being an ally. And you have to realize that an ally isn't just changing a Facebook status, posting a black box, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag stop AAPI hate, right? It is about taking action. It's not just a noun. What are you actually going to do? And then you have to realize that we're at a place in urgency in this country where we actually need more than allies. We need accomplices. What's the difference between an ally and an accomplice? A woman is in a meeting and she says something. Everyone ignores her. 5 minutes later, a man says the same thing. And everybody says, Jim, that's a great idea. An ally might send Stacy an email or meet her at the water cooler and say, hey, I just want you to know, I know you said that before, Jim. I think you're a valuable member of this team and I appreciate you. An accomplice will say that in the meeting. We're human beings. We want to be liked. So oftentimes when we speak up for these things, we do it in private. We do it over the email. We do it one-on-one over lunch because we know that that person is viewed as the person every time they come in the room. Oh, here they come again, talking about race or sexism. And we don't want to be disliked. We don't want to be put in that category. So we don't say anything because we don't want people to group us with them. But true accomplices are willing to risk something because they realize that those people who are the only woman in the meeting, the only person of color in the meeting, the only person with a disability who's constantly saying, can we have closed captions? Can we have somebody who is signing the meeting? We know those people risk something every single day, jobs, advancement, friends, right? So we have to be brave and willing to risk something. And then in your work, what can you do? I'll breeze through these last few suggestions. One, if you haven't read this journal yet, you should read it. A whole issue focused on equity, right? And one of the articles in there, I will say, is an article for me and my colleagues at Tool Design about how folks who are engineers can specifically think about this work. I think you can think about partnership. I was lucky enough last summer to work with NACDO on this new initiative. And they basically gave grants to 10 cities who were thinking about projects like outdoor dining, slow streets, and mobility hubs. And something that we had to realize is we were trying to respond to a pandemic that was happening right now, but we were trying to respond to a pandemic that was happening right now. And sometimes people wanted to ignore the years of things that had happened that we were trying to plan and engineer and design on top of, right? Again, race has always been part of the transportation story since the very beginning. Systematic racism and anti-Blackness were devastating society throughout 2020, but they've always been there, hiding in plain sight. Decades before the pandemic plowed through this country, modern American cities were built on foundations of discrimination, segregation, anti-Blackness, and racism. That is a part of our prison system. That is a part of environmental racism. That is a part of school segregation. And for many of us who have heard of this book, The Color of Law, it is about the very work we do. And so when I say you have to decenter whiteness, think about this book that is a New York Times bestseller, which again, I think is a great book I've read. You should read it if you have it. But the subtitle of A Color of Law is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Forgotten for who? As a Black person who's tried to buy a home, I haven't forgotten how our government segregated America. My friends who are Japanese American haven't forgotten how their grandparents were put into internment camps. They haven't forgotten how government segregated America. So sometimes we say things like, well, we've just never thought about equity before. We've just never done this work. This is a forgotten history. That's centering whiteness. That's centering the experience. That's allowing transportation to be a white space. We engage in planning practices that center whiteness, and we may believe our intent may be to plan in a way that includes basic perspectives and experiences, when in reality, we're planning and engineering and designing based on experiences of place and space that are only afforded to those who are able to experience those places and spaces as white people. Slow Streets is a great example. Slow Streets was all the rage when a man, Brother Ahmad, was killed running in the street, which was slow enough to run in. And then people wonder why a lot of folks of color said, I don't know if I can support Slow Streets because I'm still scared. People were like, that makes no sense. We have to realize that we have to start engaging people, not just doing outreach. Outreach is just going out and saying, here's what we're going to do. What do you think? Engagement is being open to what we think is the solution might not be right. And then there are more and more people talking about partnership, but we have to realize that all partnership isn't equal. No community partnerships is never okay. Strong community partnerships, but weak coordination behind the scenes is also not okay. We can't do this thing where the consultants and the city and the different departments aren't all talking to each other. And we have these partnerships with communities, but we're asking them to show up to 3 different meetings when they feel like I could have just come to one. When we use partners, we have to understand that we have to define and commit to equity like yesterday. We have to have honest conversations way before there's ever a crisis. We have to be upfront about capacity, understand where the pressure points are, who can shut this down, whose support do we need? And then we have to start positioning and paying community members like the leaders they are. We have to understand that power isn't just something that's a sword that we wield over people. We have to stop thinking about empowering people. We have to start thinking about co-powering people, realizing that power is already in people, right? A lot of folks like this picture because it helps them see the difference between equity and equality. Equity is you give people exactly what they need, even if some people don't get it. But that picture sucks. I hate it because it doesn't show the reality and it doesn't show where we should be trying to get, right? What we should actually be trying to do is get to freedom. I do this work because I want people to be mobile. I want people to be free and get to the places and people and things and resources that they need with dignity as their authentic selves. But understanding true power would help us understand that even this picture isn't good enough. Because who gets to determine that what these folks want to do is watch a baseball game? I live in LA. The Dodgers are World Series champions. We like baseball right now. But what if you don't like baseball? What if you want to play? What if you want to coach? What if you want to own the team? True liberation requires partnering with community and allowing there to be the ability for there to be self-determination. We have to start creating brave spaces. We have to understand the role that power plays in our work. When you are thinking of a new project or initiative or a policy, ask yourself who's going to be the most impacted by that thing you're trying to do. Who is going to be the most impacted? Whether it's good or bad impact, who's going to be the most impacted? Then look around at that decision-making group and ask if those people are represented. And if they're not only not represented, but they don't have a voice, then you know you have a power imbalance and you have to start to analyze and challenge what privileges were inherent to allow only certain people to be part of that decision-making group and not others. To think more about these brave spaces, I put an article in the chat. And I will just end by saying that I think it is important for folks to think about what you can do. I always encourage people to think, get a calendar, get a buddy, get somebody to hold you accountable, and think about what you want to start doing, what you want to stop doing, and what you want to do more of. And then set calendar reminders, 3 months, 6 months, a year. Are you really doing that thing? Are you really holding yourself accountable? And then ask yourself, after you've been to talks like this, what did you think? What did you learn? What did you feel? And I think that sometimes it helps to really, really, really think about what that would look like, right? And then think about what other people are saying and feeling, And what I always encourage people to do is I've created a resource for the participants of this talk. You can go to this link and you can just hold yourself accountable. The link stays up. You can go to it at any time. You can create post-its totally anonymous. And you could say, what do I want to start doing? What do I want to stop doing? And what do I want to do more of, right? And you just post it. And again, this stays up. And then you can come back to it and you can hold yourself accountable. What are you going to start? What are you going to stop? What are you going to do more of? And then you can force yourself to reflect. After going through this session with the Southern District, what do you think? What did you learn? What do you feel? And then give yourself time and permission to just go back through and think about what you are seeing your colleagues say, what's resonating with you, what's not resonating with you. Were you brave enough? Were you not brave? Were you vulnerable enough? And so at your leisure over the next day or so, I encourage you to go to this Jamboard and just start filling in things and then come back and do that gallery walk because it can be really powerful. Sometimes what we don't realize is it's writing something down that makes all the difference. Writing something down is really what helps us stay accountable. And so again, this will stay up. I want to make sure we have some time for questions, but just know that this is going to stay up for you. This is something that folks can do at their leisure and just add things to it. And again, when you're done, don't forget the most important part to just go back and look at what other folks are saying and really challenge yourself to hold yourself accountable. Write something down so you commit to it. And with that, I'll pass it back over to, I think you, Stacy.
Mika, thank you so much. I wish we could be in person so we could all clap for you there. We have time for a couple of questions. If you want to put questions in the chat, we're going to move to a panel discussion in a few minutes, but we do have a few time for a few questions for Tamika. We got her up early, so you might have said you weren't at your best, but you were great, especially with a new baby, right? So you've got a toddler and a new baby.
3 weeks old. Yep.
Ooh, and a different time zone. So we really appreciate you joining us today.
Of course.
Anybody have any questions they want to throw out?
I saw one question. What are some resources for people to learn how to be more of an accomplice? So some of the resources I shared, some of the books I shared are great. I think that ITE journal I shared has a lot of resources in it. And then I would just encourage people literally, to just Google. There, especially in this last year, there have been so many lists of books and resources and things you can watch and things you can do. And so now is a better time than any to just put some things into Google, and I guarantee you that a lot of resources will come up.
Mika, the North Carolina ITE president, Dr. Hummer, has shared a question about having optimism that with the future of automated vehicles, there will be no more police stops. Do you have that same optimism?
I'm very optimistic about the future. I'm cautiously optimistic because I'm a Black person in this country. Something that we did when I was at Tool, we actually wrote an article about technology. And technology is something I'm really interested in. I decided to go to UCLA for my PhD because why would you move a family with 2 kids under 2? But one of the schools that I was in final consideration that I was thinking heavily about was MIT. And it was hard to turn down because of so much of what I'm interested in with technology in the future. But what we found is I have, a whole nother presentation that's about the overlap of the white spaces of technology and transportation. If we think transportation is a white space, look at our technology companies, right? And especially those technology companies which say they're doing transportation work. So whether or not that's autonomous vehicles or scooters or Lyft and Uber, rideshare services, right? We know that those organizations are very, very white. And so when you have the overlap of transportation and the overlap of technology in the tech industry, which are predominantly male, predominantly white, yes, I'm optimistic, but there's already been data that shows that autonomous vehicles are less likely to detect and stop for darker skinned individuals. There's been a ton of research on things like soap dispensers and faucets that don't turn on in the same way for people of color. And what my wife is white, always says is, oh my gosh, those dispensers are so annoying for me as a white person. Are you telling me they work less for you? And the answer is yes, right? And so what we have to realize is sometimes folks, when they're focused on equity, they just want to focus on the outcomes. But I always tell people we also have to focus on the process. And part of the process is who's the team we're putting together to do this? Because if you're sitting around a room of people and none of them have darker skin, and so you put together an algorithm for an autonomous vehicle, and there's nobody to say, hey guys, when I was walking, it didn't see me, right? Because everybody who's walking and everybody who's doing the algorithm is the same. So while I'm hopeful, I think we also have to, again, not just focus on the outcomes that we could get, but focus on the people who are doing the work. Because sometimes if there's no one who can say, hey, when I was in my wheelchair, this car couldn't see me, you know, it's just, we're going to continue to miss it, and we're going to continue to perpetuate some of those inequities.
That's great. All right, so last question. I'm getting questions from a few different sources here, but this one seems like might epitomize, not to generalize, but might epitomize our audience best. So do you have any advice on how a middle-aged white guy can best mentor a young Black male who is entering a very white work world?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's really a question that a lot of folks ask. And this comes up a lot, for instance, when you're a part of professional organizations and on boards. People start having these equity conversations, and then you always, have a board member who perhaps is like, an older white guy who's been on the board for a long time, who says like, so should I just step down? Is that the right thing to do? And what I try to encourage people to do is realize like, no, right? Like, one, there should be term limits. So at some point you should step down. But instead of feeling guilty about our privilege, we have to start using this. I'm a person of privilege. I got to go to Stanford Law School. I have a lot of connections, a lot of networks, and I can't feel guilty about that. I have to figure out how I'm going to open the door. And so how do you do that? Sometimes we're so afraid to say the wrong thing that we just don't do anything at all, right? And I think when you're mentoring somebody who is different than you in either way, whether it's a woman and you're a man, whether or not you're white and it's someone who's Black, one, you can be honest and vulnerable. And you can literally say, I want to be helpful. I don't want to tokenize you, but I don't know how to do this. Like, how can I be helpful? What do you need? How can I support you? Right? And just asking. And then we have to realize that sometimes those folks don't even know. So when you're that person on a board, realize that part of your privilege is people respect you. You've been on the board. You've done great things for the organization that you've given time and service to. So when it's time for you to step off, people are going to listen when you say, hey, you know what? There's this young person in my firm, Tamika. She's up and coming, but she'd be great. And if you guys add her to this board, I'll continue to mentor her and support her and make sure that she's providing some of the same support I did, and I'll still be accessible to you. So how do we use our privilege to open those doors? And I saw one more question from Kevin just about like, instead of pointing to people as a different ways, why not focus on seeing each other and brothers and sisters? And I think that's a great question, right? I think that is a place where hopefully when you're mentoring somebody who's different than you get, but what we have to realize is those types of questions, while valid, the folks who have historically lacked power, they're not the ones who are forcing us to focus on race. I'm not asking everybody to focus on race because it's what I want to think about all day. If I didn't have to think about the fact that I was Black all day and how that could influence my life, do you know the things I can do, the things I could create, the sleep I could get? And so we have to realize that sometimes it's not that people don't want to just see one another as people, but that's not how society has been set up. When every form you have to fill out ever asks you to check this box or that box, that's just how we're built. And so it doesn't really help us to say, well, I'm colorblind or I don't see people like that. You may not, but the world does, the structures do. And so we have to simultaneously work on changing that while acknowledging that that's what it is and using our privilege, those of us who have it, to help, to help those who we know aren't going to be given the same shot as us. And all we can do every single day, we don't have to think that being an accomplice is some mountaintop we reach. There's going to be some days where all you can do is be an actor. There's going to be some issues where you're an accomplice and other issues where you're kind of just an ally. But all we can do is every day just keep pushing forward and hoping we're a little bit better than the day before.
Great. Thank you so much, Tamika. We really appreciate your time and all the energy that you've put into this. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
You too, absolutely. And I'm going to turn it now over to Christine Herrick to get going on our panel.
Good morning, or I suppose actually it's good afternoon now that we're 8 minutes in to our day. Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. I learned a lot. My name is Christine Herrick. I work at Kimley Horn and Associates. I am a structural engineer and I serve on Kimley Horn's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And I'm really excited today to be able to moderate this panel. I'm going to have each of the panelists introduce themselves, and we'll start with David, then we'll go to Michelle, and we'll end with Alyssa. So David, if you'll kick us off.
Hi, everyone. I am David Samba. I'm a 10-year transportation engineer and planner with Kimley Horn in our Northern Virginia office. So I'm visiting from the mid-colonial district of ITE. I am starting to transition into more of a community advocate role, and I try to use my platform as I work on projects to really elevate the voices in the community, and not just of those that are in the room, but for the people who maybe historically have felt like their voices haven't carried as far or that they had no place in the room. And I think that's really what the role of a transportation engineer or civil engineer should be doing in this field. And that's what I hope to bring to this discussion today.
Good morning, I'm Michelle Nance. I'm the Regional Planning Director at Central Carolina Regional Council, which is in Charlotte. We do planning for a 9-county region in the Charlotte area, and really focus on a lot of transportation work, active transportation, as well as transit and autonomous connected vehicles. I have the pleasure of having 4 MPOs in 2 states within our economic area. So a lot of what we do is coordination to make sure that all these transportation elements are coming together across a pretty large geographic area. I'm very interested and passionate about transit, have become very interested in that, currently leading a 12-county, 2-state regional transit project. And really the focus in our region is on equity related to how transit can provide access to all communities. And really that got started after our region was stunned by a Harvard-Cal Berkeley study that looked at the top 50 municipalities and areas around the country, and the Charlotte region was dead last. And that really woke up a lot of folks. And so not only were we looking at transit, but it really added some focus to the work that we were already doing in active transportation, access to parks, access to healthy food to create healthy communities. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Alyssa Rodriguez. I am the ITE International President. My day job, I serve as the Information Technology Director for the City of Henderson in Nevada. We're just in the Las Vegas Valley. I certainly don't profess to be an expert on this topic, but really my role as ITE president is to make sure that we continue to talk about this and that beyond the talk, we also take action. We've spent a lot of time within the organization working on diversity and inclusion. And this year, we do have a major focus on transportation equity, and we'll be advancing a lot of conversation around that. And we are just working to make sure that this is an exceptionally important topic and that we don't let it go by the wayside and that our members continue to be involved and we, like I said, take action.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to hear from each of you today. And just so that everyone knows what our format is we've got some prepared questions for each of our panelists, and we'll save some time at the end here for any questions that you all may have as well. So let's go ahead and get started. David, how are we defining and measuring equity in the transportation field?
Yeah, well, first let me say that this is going to be a tough act to follow, Tamika. So I'm going to do my best to contextualize what we think of when we think of equity and transportation. But let's start with those definitions and some things that are really important to lay out. So some terms that we probably throw around a lot in our field are accessibility, which is an individual's ability to reach, opportunities, places. Where do you want to work? Where do you play? Where are your friends? That's the elements of accessibility. And our transportation networks support that accessibility. Equality would be an equal distribution of resources, an equal distribution of those opportunities to have that accessibility. But when we talk about equity, we're talking about looking at how you adjust that distribution, adjust those resources so that solutions vary based on what a community, what a group, what a vulnerable population actually needs. So let me try to say that again. I love to use metaphors. And I think back to that image of the baseball stadium that Tamika showed. Let's say you're planning a dance. If you invite people who are different from you to a dance, that's diversity. At the dance, if you ask them to dance with you, that's inclusion. But if you actually stop and said, hey, can you help us plan the dance? Can you help us pick which music we should play? Can you help us pick out the food, the punch we should serve? That is equity. That is bringing them into the whole process. That is making a space. That is actually, let me say, that is allowing them to make their own space and make it more comfortable for everyone in the field. So in transportation, if we take that mindset, how we're defining equity in transportation is coming up with these accessible and affordable and thoughtful solutions to transportation for everyone in the community that not just one person decides upon, but everyone has a voice in deciding upon, so that we can get a fair distribution of transportation resources. So we think about how we can elevate benefits to those vulnerable communities, lower costs to those vulnerable communities, and create programs and services that actually raise everyone up and get those vulnerable communities out of that vulnerable standpoint. I think that's one other important aspect of this. Equity, I know it's tough and it makes folks a little uncomfortable to say this, but equity is about redressing some past wrongs, redressing some past unfairness. And so implicit within that, equity might look unfair. It might look like we're adding more benefits or reducing more costs to a certain group of people. That's only because those group of peoples are already in a disadvantaged standpoint. So that's how I would say that we are defining it within the industry today. However, I will also say that it is one of those elements that everyone is also putting a bit of a different flavor, a different definition on it, because I think it's an uncomfortable discussion and we're not all sure how to grapple with it. And so some folks are doing it up front. They're saying equity needs to be a part of every single thing we do. And some people are doing it as more of a retrospective technique of saying, let's just plan this project objectively. We're scientists, we're engineers, and then we can look back and say, did we do a good job from an equity standpoint? I'm not sure which is the right way to do it. Again, from a metaphor perspective, and I heard another speaker say this, from a metaphor perspective, you can think of equity as a key ingredient of a cake that you're trying to bake. So that every bite of that cake, you're going to get equity. Or you can think of it as the icing on top of the cake, which it's going to make the cake look great, but really, is that what people needed? And I think that's one of those elements that we're still trying to grapple with ourselves. Again, just how and where do we add the equity part of the conversation? Is it upfront or is it at the end and saying, did we hit our outcomes?
Thanks, David. I really like that you said equity is using all your resources to find the best solution for everyone. So Michelle, can you speak to a little bit about how do you know what the priorities are for a community in terms of equity?
Well, I first wanted to just say, based on what David said, I love the idea of baking equity in the cake. I mean, I think it's really easy to understand, and it's super important. And especially for transportation, I mean, we all know transportation takes a long time. So therefore, there are some inherent challenges in making sure that equity is not only at the forefront at the beginning of a project or just program or anything, but really seeing it all the way through. And the other piece is that with changing elected officials and community members, it's a constant effort that's really needed to infuse that equity flour or butter into the cake the whole way through. But I just wanted to say in response to the question, understanding your community, the people that you serve, who they are, what they've experienced, so looking to the past, what transportation they need right now, but also in the future for the people who are going to be moving there is especially critical. But I think it's important for us to think about that residents don't necessarily think about their needs as an equity consideration, right? So they have a geography puzzle. They've got a geography puzzle of needing to bridge a distance between an origin and destination with considerations for time and money, right? These are my needs. What can this do for me? I'm here, I need to be there. I either have a car or I don't. I either have a bike, I don't. But this is my issue. So they don't frame it. People don't frame their own needs in that way. So we have to also be thinking about, as stewards of the public trust, about communities in a very holistic manner. So we need to be thinking about, there's some people that are going to need to connect regionally. There's some folks that are also going to need to have access locally to jobs and medical services, to things that they need daily, regardless of their economic position, race, gender, or anything else. That said, we need to know more about their specific geography puzzle, right? So we've got to know what in our communities what problem are we trying to solve for? And we do that through ongoing intentional engagement, especially at the local level. It is somewhat difficult to do engagement at the state DOT level. I mean, it's been done and it's been done well. You can do really great surveys, and that can tell you that you're on the right track, or what types of modes people are interested in, where they would, like to prioritize and put the resources. But you really have to get down to that local level to really understand the community, to know what's going on. Again, to know what the past history has been so you don't repeat it. So I would really focus on the local. Now, from the MPO perspective, the MPO has a lot of power in thinking about, equitable transportation. And I would really look to, I've seen the Nashville MPO, and I call them out just because I've read a lot of their work, and they have done such a great job in changing up their prioritization scheme to look at health. And basically that means changing the mode split, right? So instead of the resources just going to, highways and bridges, they're looking a lot at, transit and, pedestrian facilities and bike facilities. And we know in the transportation world that in order to get equitable transportation, we have to have a mode split. We have to have, these different types of avenues or transportation choices at the ready, so that people can get where they need to go. So it's really up to us in a lot of ways to really be pressing for those things. And, let's just be clear. We know that a lot of times the biggest hurdle to getting that transportation choice is just the first step of getting off status quo. And I think as we engage our communities, we need to just be mindful that we've got to have masterful messaging about what active transportation can do for you, what transit can do for the community in terms of economic competitiveness, from a global standpoint, in terms of, just getting people where they need to go and advancing their life.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. So you've talked a little bit, Michelle, about kind of the community engagement side and the implementation side. So Alyssa, if you can talk about what comes before that, the project selection, what are the challenges in including equity as a performance measure in project selection and development?
Well, I love a good baking analogy, so I'll keep on cooking with that one. I feel like equity is an ingredient that we've all heard of. We're just not sure how to incorporate it in our recipes. And I think that's maybe one of the most challenging things as human beings, is that change management piece. Like, how do I get used to something that makes me a little bit uncomfortable and I'm not quite sure how to put all the pieces together to make a good recipe? And so probably number one in the challenge of including that in our performance measures for project selection is just that it's new and different and we're not used to it. And, we're all very comfortable with the status quo. I think there are some other pieces to that. I think we're utilizing public money. And when we start to talk about equity, I think there's some uncomfortable conversations to be had about, have we always been the best stewards of our public money? Have we been using it to its highest and best use? Has the money collected from all of our residents been used to benefit all of our residents? And so when we start to have some of those conversations, I think it definitely creates some challenges. To fall back on something David said, we have to do some work to find out what people actually want, what they actually need. And certainly one of the challenges with project selection, project prioritization is that might change depending on the community that you're working in. So there may be a focus on safety. Of course, there's always a focus on safety, but maybe some specifics on safety as far as how it affects certain populations. We may be talking about access to economic outcomes, access to jobs, or mobility of the workforce within the particular neighborhood. We could be talking about health outcomes, as Michelle talked about, that may be most important to the neighborhood. And so it kind of challenges our standardization process in that we may have to alter our approach depending on what the community needs are. I think in some cases it competes with some of our other more traditional performance measures. I think about things like an innocuous project like streetlight maintenance or maybe a streetlight upgrade. I had a conversation with my girlfriends over the weekend that we are very intentional about where we go running and at what time, because we just don't feel safe being out in a dark area at night because of what happens to female runners. But imagine that if you are a person of color and that your very presence is a threat to other people. And so, the street lights and the adding light or enhanced light or updated light to be the LED that gives you extra clarity, maybe even more important to a specific neighborhood because of the safety outcomes. I remember very clearly a panel that I moderated with Veronica Davis from Houston, and she did a survey with her community, and their community members were concerned about gun violence. And certainly that's different from anything that I've personally experienced, but something as simple as upgrading the streetlight system can have an impact on that and adding additional safety light to that community. And so we may want to tackle streetlights first by looking at which ones are oldest or which ones are drawing the most power, but maybe we need to take a look at that from another lens. And so when we're talking about these project selections, some of our measures may compete against each other. And then I think there's a concern that, Michelle mentioned that transportation projects take a long time. And that is certainly true. And I think there's a concern that if we add yet another performance measure to it, and something that is a little bit more complicated perhaps than we had considered in the past, may just add even more time to the process. That you're going to have to spend some time gathering additional data or do some public outreach and in specifically engagement with the adjacent neighborhoods. But I would also suggest that it could slow you down if you don't do it. I know we had a huge freeway interchange project here in the Las Vegas Valley, and when they were done, there was a major community pushback because they had completely cut off the connection to one of our historic neighborhoods. And so guess what? We had to start all over and rebuild that freeway project. And so it just extended the time of it. And so I think some of those are the big concerns. Number one, it's new and it's different and we're comfortable with that. I think it competes with some things we've always traditionally done. And I think there's a concern about adding time to the process.
Thank you, Alyssa. So David, coming very full circle, we started today's panel asking about definitions and how do we measure equality. Michelle talked about the priorities of equality in the community. I'm sorry, equity. And Alyssa's just talked through project selection and impact to the development side. But can you talk about how do we know when we've achieved success with a project in terms of equity?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that we can think of it. And I think first I'll address that, a lot of us in the room or in the virtual room are engineers. And so we think of data, right? So we think about, well, how can we actually put points into a page, data to a page to say whether or not we check the box. What some groups are doing, again, thinking about accessibility, looking at population data, race, income, language proficiency, and they're trying to map where were projects funded, where were projects developed, initiated, constructed, and how are they serving those communities just on the basis of looking at a map. So that's what's happening in Portland, Oregon. They created something called an equity matrix, and that's one realm of doing it. And again, from the data perspective, there's a tool created by the Urban Institute, which is I believe it's called the unequal commute tool, which is it's a very gravity model way of measuring how do you connect where people live with where they want to be. So low wage, low income folks, or how long does it take them to get to their jobs, to schools, to libraries, to hospitals? And then you can kind of see like, well, then where did our transportation project intersect with those commutes? How did we either help create more access or create barriers, hinder that travel? But I think we need to think a little bit beyond just the data of this, and we need to start rethinking the entire project lifecycle. First, we need to rethink, when are we done with the project? Is it, when we write the final report, or when the shovel goes to ground, or when the project is open, quote unquote? Or do we need to have an extended project cycle that actually touches back in with those community members and says, did we meet the needs that you expressed to us throughout the project? Are your lives demonstrably better through our service? And if not, then I would say we didn't achieve the success. I would also think that, we need to both have an honest appraising of equity in the attempt and the outcome. So in the attempt, to what Alyssa was saying, when we're trying to prioritize projects, to even decide which project we should go forward and pursue in the community, that's a great place to think about equity, to think about, okay, well, which communities is this going to elevate? Which communities might this harm? And that's all in the attempt. That's all upfront. But then at the outcome, we need to see, well, what actually happened? What actually is the result of these types of projects? We might think to ourselves, well, let's do an arterial management project. Let's make this arterial move a little better because we think there's a vulnerable community that needs to have more efficient travel to jobs. But by doing that, by making that arterial more efficient, did we create an unintended consequence? Is it now more challenging to bike ride or walk? And if so, that population that's bike riding, walking, are they just as vulnerable or even more so than the initial vulnerable community that we were trying to serve? So again, picking up on something Alyssa said, and I totally understand the fear that some folks might have that adding equity as a prioritization method, or even as just a tool to look at your projects, will add more time to a project, and it probably will. But I would also posit that it's going to add more value to your projects. We're actually going to get the projects that people need, want, and will have that demonstrable impact to improve their lives.
Thank you, David. Michelle, how can we ensure that we are reaching all vulnerable populations as we try to achieve the equity and be successful in the equity that David just talked about? And that includes, not just racial populations, racially different, but several different demographics.
Sure. I'm going to answer this question kind of like a funnel, start big picture and then narrow it down to an individual project. I believe transportation is really the key to upward economic mobility. In the Charlotte region, I've heard so many, personal stories about the consequences of lack of access, whether it's, folks in a certain county not being able to see past a 2-year degree, or in a ring county around Charlotte, they did not have a place to birth a baby in a medical facility. So transportation, extremely important, for those populations to get to the other community. So nationally, if you think about our household expenses on transportation, they're up close to $9,000 a year, followed by housing. And when you start to think about that holistically, that transportation and housing cost for a household, and what you might be able to do by offering the different types of transportation, the different types of modes, it becomes pretty clear that we have to be looking at transportation and land use collectively. And I know that is not a simple feat, right? If it was easy to do, it would have been done. But I will say that as you're working in a community, even though your focus may be on streetlights or something very, granular in terms of the whole community, please talk with the land use planners to better understand what they have planned for the area, not in terms of transportation, not from the MPO perspective, but what are they looking at in terms of land use? Is this going to be an area adjacent that will start looking at, a key industrial corridor? Or is this an area where they're trying to densify that residential development? And if we did this project instead of that one, it might, provide a better connection into that community, or connect between a destination spot, such as a park or school, to a residential area. Really step back and look at the 10,000, foot level and think about the community in a more holistic way. Now, for an individual project, you're of course going to look at your, demographics, your poverty, your population density, what areas are faster growing. There's actually some really good equity indexes out there that can help you look at equity from a variety of perspectives, right? Not just race, not just poverty. And this is really your chance to become really creative. So, to start looking at some localized, person-centered information about, where are the senior centers in a community? Where are the veterans trying to get to? Women are primary caregivers for seniors and children. They have higher poverty rates than men, and they'll need transportation longer, because guess what? They live longer. So, think about how your project is impacting women. And we just heard about the street lights. Actually, from a transit perspective, women are actually paying more for their transportation, because at night, a lot of times they don't want to use transit, and they'll do Uber or Lyft or take a taxi. So there are all types of implications from a lot of different populations. So it's understandable that it's very difficult to engage all of these segments of the communities. So you really have to dig a little deeper and, think about ways that you can go one level up if you can't address all of these populations. Talk to the faith-based communities. They have a handle on what is going on. So if you can work with them or other community-based organizations to better understand, the Latin American Chamber of Commerce, for example, if you want to be in that community and understand what's going on, talk to them. They'll know exactly what the issues are. Workforce development boards, each, counties typically have those, or regions, and they know a lot about, what are the transportation needs? They know what they're hearing. What are those issues? So I would just say it requires you to be a little more creative, but those are just a few ideas. And then if you could look up some equity indexes, I think that'll get you there.
I definitely think this is a feat of creativity. So Alyssa, how do we incorporate equity throughout a project, not through just project selection and development, but all the way through design and construction? And as David mentioned, even after that.
Yeah, I love that topic of the project cycle. Particularly working for a government agency, we think about that all the time. It's not just the planning, but how do we operate and maintain these projects after they're constructed? And so I think that we need to remember that at each point along the project cycle, we have the ability to make choices. And Michelle listed a lot of ways that we can engage with communities, and we can find out what the community needs are. And hopefully along that process of engagement, we've built some trust. And we've built some trust with the community at the project selection stage as well. And we can start to build on that trust to learn big picture, what's happening with land use in the area, big picture, what are the community goals, what are their needs, what are they trying to accomplish with transportation in their area, and then start to apply that to the project design. I read this really fabulous quote. It's from Vera Keller. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Oregon. And she said, transparency about our ignorance makes the knowledge we communicate more trustworthy and extends a hand to others. And so I envision this from a transportation design perspective, that we're a consulting firm or we're a public agency and we're coming into a community and say, hey, we're going to do a transportation project here. We've identified it as being a priority, but we don't know what your needs are. I don't live here or I don't work here, but I want to do the best project for you. So you tell me what you need. And we work through that engagement process to find out what they truly need with their transportation project. And then we can use our knowledge as transportation professionals to creatively wrap our design around their needs and really make it special and valuable to that community. I think that you can continue to do that as you go through construction, because there's a lot of different things, a lot of different choices that you can make during construction. Would it be best to close down the facility completely and complete the construction within 3 days so that it's a significant interruption, but of a short period of time? Would it be better to stretch it out a little bit longer and do the construction during the day so that you're not interrupting the sleep of the workforce that's in the area? Or would it be better to do it at night so that you're not interrupting the commuter flow during the day or affecting the kids that are walking to school in that neighborhood? So there's a lot of different choices that we can make during construction, and we can really have an impact on how that construction affects the community. And then even thinking long-term as far as operation and maintenance, we want to make sure that that project continues to have value for the community. And so that having a good maintenance plan in place, make sure that the components that we added as part of that design project continue to work and continue to look good. Are we going to set up a regular street sweeping schedule? Are we going, if there's a landscaping included, how are we going to ensure that it continues to look beautiful and really be a showpiece for that community? So I think it's a matter of making some choices and continuing to engage with that community, and then continuing to look back on our performance measures that we set. And I love what David said about circling back with that community and making sure that is this truly doing what we intended? Are there tweaks that we need to make? Are we still offering you the economic outcomes or the safety outcomes that we had hoped to accomplish with this project?
That's a perfect way to end our planned questions. Thank you, Alyssa, for taking us through the project cycle and how equity plays into it. So I know we've got 5 minutes left. I think if anyone's got questions out there, if you will type them into the chat box and we can direct them to the appropriate panelists. Everyone's eating their lunches, so. Well, y'all may be getting off easy. I don't see any questions coming in. Well, Stacy, I may just turn it back over to you since I'm not seeing any questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much to everybody on our panel. I think y'all did such a great job that no one has any questions. So good job. Reminder to everybody that we are on a break from now until 1:45. We start some concurrent sessions at 1:45. So there's 2 sets of sessions this afternoon. So just check out the email or your agenda to see what's coming up. I want to thank again all of our sponsors, but especially our session sponsor for today, which is WSP. And with that, everybody can go eat for real.
Thank you.